Hello, my name is Emiel de Lange, and I'm going to talk to you today about a chapter from my recently completed PhD, which is titled The Effects of Social Networks on Interventions to Change Conservation Behavior. And I completed this research under the supervision of Professor Milne Gulland and Dr. Aidan Keane while I was at the University of Edinburgh. So why study social networks and social relations? Well, from across the social sciences, there's a vast body of evidence and theory that emphasizes the central role that relations play in human life and in human behavior. From a social psychological perspective, we can conceptualize this as the way in which relations act as conduits for information that we use to update our beliefs about the world and about our behaviors, and especially how social relations act as a way of generating social meaning about the world, for example, about social norms and the kinds of behaviors that are appropriate in certain social contexts or not. Now, if we zoom out a little bit, we can conceptualize relationships between people as ties in a network that give a sort of structure to social groups and populations. And analyzing these networks has shed a lot of light on how behaviors in particular social structures shape changes in behavior. Recently, the theory of complex contagions, which has come out of computational studies across vast social media networks, has shed light on how complex contagions, which includes many kinds of behavior, spread in different ways compared to simple contagions, which are things like information or viruses. Simple contagions can spread directly across single weak ties that potentially span across entire social groups. Whereas complex contagions require social reinforcement, and therefore they require dense connections between multiple individuals in a group in order to spread. And that's because those individuals are likely looking for normative confirmation, they need to coordinate with each other, or perhaps because they're seeking information about the world from multiple sources before they decide to adopt a new behavior. Given the central role of social relations and therefore social networks in human behavior, it's no surprise that conservation scientists are starting to turn their attention towards these processes of change. But most of the studies that have looked at networks in conservation are cross-sectional. They look at network and behavior at a single point in time. But clearly, behavior change is a temporal process, and there's a need for longitudinal type research to unpick how these processes of social change occur in the context of conservation interventions. We sought to address this gap using a case study intervention carried out by our partners at the Wildlife Conservation Society and the Ministry of Environment of Cambodia in the north of the country. This intervention aimed to promote the uptake of a reporting hotline that could be used to report pesticide contamination, which had been identified as a key threat to wildlife in the area. The intervention took the form of a community meeting where different media and different messengers were used to convey information about this issue. In addition, materials were provided that aimed to maintain the salience of the issue as well as facilitate communication between members of the community. In our case study village, we invited just 40 people to attend the intervention in a village of about 400 adults. And this allowed us to kind of conduct a natural experiment, understanding how the relations between these groups of adults might change and influence intervention outcomes. We collected 4 waves of data using questionnaire surveys. In October 2017, we conducted a preliminary survey where we measured the community social networks, asking respondents to tell us who they communicated with and who they spent time with. And we used this data throughout our study. Then in January 2019, we conducted a baseline first survey measurement of the psychological outcomes related to the intervention. We used the theory of planned behavior to structure this, so we measured constructs such as people's intention to report poisoning, their attitudes towards reporting poisoning, their perceptions of relevant social norms, as well as their perception of their own ability to report poisoning. The intervention took place the following month in February 2019. And again, a month later, we conducted a follow-up survey where we remeasured those psychological outcomes as well as measuring people's knowledge about messages related to the intervention. Finally, in August of that year, we conducted a final follow-up survey where we remeasured psychological outcomes, we remeasured knowledge, and we also remeasured the social network. We used linear models such as generalized linear models and mixed effect models to analyze how the psychological outcomes and knowledge outcomes varied across time and across groups. We used stochastic actor-oriented models to model the relationship between the network and those outcomes. This is a kind of model of network behavior coevolution that simulates the decisions of individuals in the network over continuous time, while referring to the data that's collected at fixed time points. We constructed a conceptual model describing the expected outcomes and processes of social change that we thought we'd see following the intervention, and we used this to guide our hypothesis testing. I will now take you through that model step by step before going through the results. Firstly, we expected that those who attended the intervention would become knowledgeable about intervention messages. We also expected that those who attended the intervention would show an increased intention to report poisoning. We expected that from the perspective of others in the community, their peers would become knowledgeable as well, so the knowledge might spread to others who were not participating in the intervention. We expected that knowledge might be communicated between peers in the social network. Information would flow. We also expected that from the perspective of an individual, their peers may show changed intentions to report poisoning, and that intentions might be changing across the community beyond the intervention group. Finally, we expected that gaining knowledge about the intervention might influence an individual's intention to report poisoning. We also expected social influence to occur, that the intentions of an individual's peers would affect their own intentions. We further unpacked the cognitive mechanisms that might be going on here, using the theory of planned behavior, as you can see on the right of the figure. This allowed us to test more specific social influence mechanisms. The most simple was, as described, that an individual's intentions would be influenced by the intentions of their social peers. But a more specific mechanism might be operating through the perceived social norms. For example, the attitudes of an individual's peer might influence their own perceptions of injunctive norms, whereas the intentions of their peers might influence their perceptions of the descriptive norms. Going back to our first hypothesis, we did indeed see that those who participated in the intervention became knowledgeable about key messages and were able to recall about 58% of messages on average following the intervention. 6 months later, they were still able to recall about half of the intervention messages that we questioned them about. We saw that those who attended the intervention showed changes in their intentions and perceived control and perceived norms, which all significantly increased following the intervention. However, after 6 months, this effect had disappeared and there was no significant change from the baseline. We saw that other villagers who did not attend the intervention also learned about key messages from the intervention, and after 6 months, about 40% of the community, over 141 respondents, had some knowledge of the intervention. When we asked them about the source of this information, 35% said they learned from others in their social network, whereas 50% could not recall. Our net models confirm the role of the social networks here, showing that having knowledgeable peers increased the chance that an individual would become knowledgeable by 1.39 times, and having a knowledgeable household member almost doubled the chance that the individual would become knowledgeable. So there was information flow occurring here through the social network. Other people in the village who did not attend the intervention also showed changes in their beliefs and intentions. Following the intervention, there were significant increases in intention and perceived control across the entire village. After 6 months, intentions had reverted back to baseline levels, but perceived control remained high, and attitudes and perceived descriptive norms were now also significantly higher across the whole village. One mechanism that could explain this would be that the knowledge that spread was used to update beliefs about the world and therefore increased intentions. And we did see a correlation between knowledge and increased outcomes. However, the stochastic actor-oriented model showed us that this was not a causal relationship, and gaining knowledge did not lead to subsequent changes in those outcomes. Instead, the model showed us that social influences were a key driver of changes in intention, as individuals updated their intentions in order to better reflect the intentions of their social peers. In fact, an individual was 1.24 times more likely to change, increase, or decrease their intention to be closer to their social peers than they were to not do that. When we looked at the specific mechanisms that could explain these peer influences, however, we did not find that attitudes had an effect on perceptions of injunctive norms, nor did intentions of peers have an effect on perceived descriptive norms. In conclusion, our results show that conservation behaviours, such as reporting of pesticide contamination, are complex contagions which require peer reinforcement and social influences in order to spread. Although knowledge, a simple contagion, spread widely, this was not sufficient to change intentions in the long term, as social influences may have played an obstructive role. This means that when we design our interventions, we need to account for these social relations and for the structures of these social networks. And we can learn from fields like public health, where they have developed network interventions that account for this by strategically targeting or connecting different segments of a population as a behavior diffuses. We suggest that innovative modeling and evaluation approaches, such as we have demonstrated, can be used to test and develop these strategies and learn from them in conservation contexts. Thank you very much for listening. You can scan the QR code here to access our paper, which is Open Access in Conservation Biology. And finally, I'd like to thank all the partners, collaborators, and funders of our research.